Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 28th of September. I'm James Heale, the Spectator's political correspondent and your host for this week's episode. Coming up on the show. Should Britain leave the European Convention on Human Rights? Former Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Sumption lays out the case in this week's magazine, and he'll join the show with one-time Attorney General Dominic Grieve. Who's the favourite to succeed Rishi Sunak? It's Tory conference next week, and the Manchester Jamboree could be a pageant of aspirant hopefuls. Can Rishi Sunak's team keep a lid on ambitious MPs? I'll be speaking to Katy Balls and Iain. American Senator Lindsey Graham says Ukraine should hold elections, but who will stand against President Zelensky? Owen Matthews will be on the show. And finally, the first authorised biography of Iain Fleming since 1966 is being released next month. It's reviewed in this week's Spectator, and the book's author, Nicholas Shakespeare, will join me to talk about the man who imagined James Bond. Before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thousands are joining our channel every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode. First up, former Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Sumption writes this week's cover piece about the case for leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. The convention, he says, has become intrusive and banal. To expound on his argument, Jonathan joins me now alongside the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve. This week, Jonathan, you write the cover piece, which is about the case for the UK actually leaving the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yes.
Can you explain your argument for us?
I've got no problem at all about the text of the convention. I do have quite a serious problem about the way in which the text has been treated by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Since the 1970s, they have operated in accordance with what they call a living instrument doctrine. And that essentially has been treated as a way of expanding on the text by a process of extrapolation and analogy, so as to produce a very large number of rights, some of which are loosely ancillary to existing rights, but many of which are freestanding. I think that this is an essentially legislative process and involves a usurpation of the function of democratic legislatures. We do not need the Human Rights Convention in order to protect human rights, and I certainly wouldn't like to see it abolished unless we replace it with something equivalent. So what I would suggest is that we should replace it with something that would look very much the same as the Convention, but which would not be subject to the jurisdiction of the Strasbourg Court.
Dominic, what do you make of Jonathan's argument there?
Start with something we agree on. I'm certainly in agreement with him that if the United Kingdom were to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, but continue, for example, to operate the Human Rights Act as its domestic Bill of Rights, then I think our human rights in this country would continue to be pretty well protected. There is a risk that in certain circumstances, on a declaration of incompatibility, Parliament and government might decide to do nothing about it, but Jonathan has a perfectly good point that can be argued to be within the way a democracy operates if it's fully debated in Parliament. But that, for me, is not why we signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights in the first place. We signed up to it because it was an international treaty that was intended to confer international benefits on the United Kingdom, raising the standards of human rights in other European countries, which in my view it has done exceptionally well, and at the same time showing that we were prepared to be bound by this international convention, which is ultimately interpreted by an international tribunal, the Court of Human Rights, as a way of persuading those other countries to adhere to it. And the difficulty is that if you decide to leave it, you are going to have a whole series of consequences that will flow from it. And it can be listed quite easily, some of them. One of the early ones is that our trade and cooperation agreement with the EU will undoubtedly be jeopardised. It may be possible to work around it. Our participation in the Horizon project would become impossible because it requires data sharing, and data sharing is seen as being absolutely underpinned post our leaving the EU by shared adherence to the convention. And in the context of Northern Ireland, there would be some significant issues about where Northern Ireland remained within the ambit of the convention or not, and how you would do that if a sovereign state withdraws, because it is explicit and implicit in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement that we would be there. So there would be very significant consequences. And like everything else in an international treaty, you should, if you're considering withdrawing it or participating in it, you should be weighing the pros and the cons. And where I think I disagree with Jonathan is that when it comes to looking at the downsides of this, then whilst I accept that the court has occasionally made decisions which I disagree with, and I actually think have been rather foolish at times, but then even our own Supreme Court has occasionally done decisions which I thought were rather foolish domestically. But when you actually look at the way this court is now operating, particularly since Ken Clarke and I negotiated the Brighton Declaration in 2012 and changed the way it operated, in practice we've had very little difficulty adhering to it. And actually the number of cases which have caused a ripple since have been almost non-existent. I think last year, the best I would try to look it up before I came here, but as far as I could see, there were only 2 judgments against the UK that could be regarded as covering new ground, as opposed to cases where we hadn't dealt with a previous judgment and so another judgment came along. And they were both matters where actually the government was perfectly happy. One was bereavement support grants and discrimination, and the other one was about journalists being harassed by the police for tweets that the journalist considered was acceptable and the police didn't, and a wrongful arrest which followed. Most of the big issues, prisoner voting, whole life tariffs, have all been resolved without anybody really being aware it's happened. So whilst I accept that this court isn't perfect, no human institution is perfect. Sure. I think that the reputational consequences to the United Kingdom of leaving and the practical consequences of leaving vastly outweigh any possible advantage that it might confer on us.
What do you think about that, Jim?
Well, I fundamentally disagree with much of that. Most international multilateral treaties are designed to enable one to achieve things internationally which we could not achieve on our own. This is a rather special case because the Human Rights Convention is a treaty which deals with matters, every single one of which we could deal with on our own. Now, what Dominic says is, well, it encourages human rights in other places. And that was certainly the rather patronizing basis on which we acceded to it originally. We basically said to ourselves that we already have all of these benefits. They've been part of English law for a long time, which was mainly but not entirely true. We're joining this because we want to confer the advantages that we've had for a long time on these benighted Europeans. That was essentially the attitude. I am sceptical about how much we have actually achieved internationally. There are countries which have been released from decades of tyranny in Eastern Europe, who have been desperate to improve their human rights record and have successfully done it. I believe that they would have done it whether the United Kingdom was party to this treaty or not. There are other countries like Belarus and Russia and to some extent Turkey which have set their face against giving effective scope to the Human Rights Convention in spite of the fact that they were parties to it, and no amount of adverse judgment has improved their degree of compliance. Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe last year. Belarus has not been expelled, but its human rights record is absolutely dismal. The participation of the United Kingdom in the convention has made absolutely no difference to them. There are some things which I would accept. First of all, I would accept that if we withdrew from the convention, we would not be able to withdraw from it in respect of Northern Ireland, because the Good Friday Agreement specifically requires that we confer on them not just human rights, but the human rights envisaged in the convention. So I think that unless something could be negotiated with the Irish government, which I regard as most unlikely, we would have to leave Northern Ireland in the convention system. I don't accept that it would create problems with the EU. The EU treaty requires its members to have satisfactory arrangements for preserving human rights. It doesn't require its members to adhere to the convention, although they all do. It seems to me, therefore, that if we had a system of human rights which was dependent on enforcement by independent judges who are perfectly up to the job, which would be the case in this country, I think the EU would probably accept that. The problem really is that we have to decide not whether we like this or that or the other decision that the Strasbourg court makes. People will no doubt differ on that. The real question is, how do you make law for a democracy? And the problem that the Strasbourg court raises is that whereas if you have a wholly domestic system of human rights protection, if something goes wrong, if courts make silly decisions, which they sometimes do, I quite agree with Dominic about that, you can deal with it, you can correct it because you are basically masters of the national scheme yourself. But there is absolutely no way of correcting the errors of the Strasbourg court. The members of the Council of Europe have no input whatever into its decision-making process. Now, Dominic cites the Brighton Declaration. I have to say that the Brighton Declaration has, in my view, made very little difference to the way that they operate. I spoke only the other day to two members of the court who said, that we look intensely with great care at the subsidiarity and all these other things, many of which are basically reflected in the Brighton Convention. But the test is whether this can be seen in their decisions, and I don't believe that it can.
Well, I obviously disagree with that, and just to give a couple of examples. Firstly, there is a degree of dialogue between our own national courts and the Strasbourg court, which can continue even when the Strasbourg court's made a decision that we think may be wrong. And examples of this are around, and the Strasbourg court does listen to what our own Supreme Court does. So, for example, political advertising, which I think was seen as being a restriction on freedom of expression when it was first being considered in Strasbourg, once the Supreme Court had explained why we had such rules on managing political advertising. It stopped same with rules on hearsay in criminal courts. You could argue that actually there was a very extensive dialogue over prisoner voting, so eventually it was resolved by a minute change to the prison regulations. I accept this is not a perfect system, but it is one where there's undoubtedly dialogue, and the dialogue is all the better when there's trust. One of the problems is when the United Kingdom starts huffing and puffing and saying it's about to pull out, when, if you want my personal opinion, there is no prospect whatsoever of it happening under the present government at all. So this is another sort of pre-party conference puff, I have to say to you. Every time that happens, it reduces the trust, and the reduction in the trust then leads to examples like applying Rule 39 and giving an interim order to prevent deportation to Rwanda, which I happen to think was completely unnecessary, because I at least do have confidence that if the United Kingdom were ultimately to have a judgment against it after it had deported somebody to Rwanda, we'd have brought them back. But equally, turning that into some great issue, in my view, when it's just a procedural matter, is to exaggerate the problems and failing to see the advantages. And I do also fundamentally disagree about the issue about impact. And just to take two examples, adherence to the convention is seen as a benchmark and standard of human rights. It even has a positive impact outside of convention countries. Theresa May's willingness to take the brickbats from the tabloid press of Abu Qatada ultimately led the Jordanian government changing its own criminal justice system to prevent the admissibility of evidence that might have been obtained under torture, which is something I think we would all think was a good thing. And at the moment in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh, you have a humanitarian crisis brought on by the fact that the inhabitants who are legally in Azerbaijan, whatever has been happening there previously, are in great fear of persecution in their lives. the Azeri government, for all its faults, is a signatory member of the convention and will be placed under very considerable pressure as to how it operates in respect of a minority community. All those things, in my view, are advantageous. And I happen to think that Jonathan is underestimating this bit of UK soft power. At best, we've been seen as leaders in this, and it has, particularly in the ex-communist countries after the wall came down, which often had no traditions of democratic accountability at all, and a lot of authoritarian administrative decision-making, it's made a very great impact. And finally, I disagree, because Jonathan characterised international treaties as being there to regulate relations between states.
No, I didn't do that.
Well, that's roughly it. But what I since the Second World War, a lot of international treaties are about the behaviour of states towards their own citizens and the willingness of states to circumscribe their sovereignty in order to achieve certain standards. And obviously a question arises, but on the question of democracy, is that acceptable or not? But I think in the overall context of democratic government and trying to achieve both democracy and freedom and the rule of law, I think it's a balance that we've probably got just about right. I'm not saying that there aren't frictions, and I'm not saying that the court in Strasbourg always gets it right. But I think that to simply say you should just leave this entirely to sovereign governments to get on with, I think we will then find that overall the standard of human rights that we enjoy, particularly on the European continent, will slip.
Well, I think that all the advantages which you cite are perfectly capable of being achieved if we have a reputation for defending human rights domestically. I don't think that we need the convention in order to do it. I entirely agree that there is dialogue between our courts and the courts and the Strasbourg court. And I also agree that there are some cases in which the Strasbourg court has, usually without admitting it, been prepared to back down. But for every case like that, there are a number of cases in which they have not backed down. I mean, just to cite two examples, the Strasbourg court has made policing in countries of the Council of Europe, including ourselves, very much more difficult by considerably restricting the amount of intelligence that they can retain or the kind of evidence that they can use. Another example, the Strasbourg court has made it extremely difficult for European armies to participate effectively in peacekeeping operations by purporting to extend the convention to the activities of armed forces in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. In the process, it has made it extremely difficult to retain prisoners of war, to the immense dismay not only of countries with peacekeeping forces in these places, but also of the Red Cross. I think that Dominic is absolutely right to say that the picture is not an even one. There are examples where the system works satisfactorily, but there are too many examples of cases where it doesn't work at all satisfactorily for this to be a sensible way of making law for our society.
I think you both agree on the fact that I think the debate around the ECHR has often been quite a facile one. And
yes, and I wouldn't pin it on immigration, which has, I think, got very little to do with human rights convention. The problems that we're having are due to other factors. And I wouldn't therefore want to withdraw simply because of, e.g., the admittedly disgraceful behaviour of the Strasbourg court over Rule 39 and Rwanda. I mean, I've got very little patient time for the Rwanda scheme. I don't think it's going to work. But I think that the way that the British courts were treated over that was, and the British government was treated, was frankly disgraceful. But I don't think one should take single incidents and treat them as a reason for withdrawing. That is just rhetoric. I would say my views are essentially based on the experience of decades of Strasbourg jurisprudence. And I originally felt we should perhaps wait to see whether they could reform themselves internally, whether the Brighton Declaration would work. I have very reluctantly come to the conclusion that this is too ungainly an institution with too much esprit de corps and too much ideological commitment to change.
And how do you see this debate unfolding in the coming years? I mean, the Conservatives have been talking about it ahead of the conference season. As Dominic mentions, but where do you see it?
Well, my position is a minority position, both in the country at large and I think in Parliament and indeed even within the Conservative Party. I recognise that. But the fact that I'm in a minority isn't going to stop me from pointing out the costs that we have to pay.
Dominic, do you think it's going to be a stable part of British life, war debates around the ECHR?
Well, the debate around the ECHR has been running a long time. Admittedly, it's principally been focused on getting rid of the Human Rights Act, having a Bill of Rights, and somehow staying compliant with the ECHR, even though there's a desire to make it non-compliant. And that has been a 15-year, utterly sterile argument. It led to the sacking of at least one Attorney General I can think of. And at the end of it, we have made absolutely no progress because it was a very poorly thought out scheme. Now, I accept, actually, that logically leaving the ECHR entirely has a more logical ring to it, but it also brings with it these consequences. And it's obviously an area where Jonathan and I, whilst we agree on some things, also I think have a sort of fundamentally different take on the advantages of internationalism. I was Attorney General when the Court of Human Rights started creating difficulties over detaining battlefield combatants in Afghanistan, and I entirely agree with him. I think they had got the wrong end of the stick very badly. But actually, some subsequent jurisprudence suggests that we've got out of that, and they've now understood that, in fact, international humanitarian law has got to be taken into account, the law of the battlefield. So, whilst I accept that there are hiccups, irritations, things I disagree with, and like any international court with 46 judges on it, there are going to be issues around that. Actually, I don't think it is doing us anything like as much harm as Jonathan thinks, and I think it is a vehicle for continuing to do good. And for that reason, I think that this argument will not go anywhere, because I don't think a UK Prime Minister, whether it's Rishi Sunak or turns out to be Keir Starmer after the next election, is going to be minded to start tinkering with our adherence to a treaty which, and here I disagree with Jonathan, is seen as really fundamentally important by our EU partners in terms of our continuing relationship now we're out of the EU. So the political consequences of that being so profound, and with it, the economic consequences that might go with it, I don't think it'll happen.
We look forward to covering that debate in The Spectator. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dominic. Next, Tory conference starts this weekend, and Rishi Sunak is looking to set out his stall ahead of a general election next year. But could the Manchester meeting be overshadowed by posturing from future leadership hopefuls? Katy Balls joins me, with LBC's Iain Dale. Suella Braverman has been in America, giving a big speech at the American Enterprise Institute, in which she notably criticised multiculturalism and the asylum system we have. Iain, what was your reaction to that speech?
Well, I had the misfortune of watching the whole thing live, which I might not normally do, but had been fairly heavily briefed in advance. I thought, well, I need to watch it before I can really comment on it. And I thought she raised one or two pertinent issues, but she did it in a way that I thought was just deliberately antagonising everybody. And there wasn't an ounce of empathy or compassion in the speech. It was all about dividing lines, and it wasn't the kind of speech that I think a British Home Secretary should make on American soil. Whether she should even make it here, I don't know. But I thought it was largely vaguely offensive. And she seems to specialise in this, and I do understand why, because it is looking ahead to a future Tory leadership contest in which she can be the candidate of the right. And to be fair to her, if that's her strategy, it's working quite well because everybody's talking about it. But if she was to be the leader of the opposition, if Labour win the next election, I dread to think what will happen to the unity of the Tory party.
Katy, how much of this should be seen as positioning ahead of the conference, which starts this Sunday in Manchester?
Well, I think there's a few factors. The number 10 line is effectively, she is the Home Secretary. She is giving a speech on immigration, on migration, on small boats, and that is in her brief, and also the speech was cleared by number 10. But as Iain alludes to, I think that what will probably be a theme also at the Tory party conference is, I think if we think back to a year ago, when Liz Truss was at conference. Tory MPs do not want to think back to it. If you say the words conference to MPs. You sort of do get a bit of a shudder.
If you say Liz Truss to MPs, you get
that
a shudder.
too. There's a mix. But I think just how bad that conference was for the party in the end. It started with Liz Truss thinking she can smooth things after the mini budget. Instead, it began really with Michael Gove turning on her on live TV. She quickly U-turned on a policy. Then you had the cabinet losing all sense of collective responsibility. She slightly called things back with her speech about the anti-growth coalition, but was gone less than a month later. So it wasn't, a peak for Tory success stories. Rishi Sunak enters a much more stable environment. I think we could still have some drama, some high stakes, some blue on blue at this conference, but no one credible I know is talking about, even those who don't particularly rate Rishi Sunak, is seriously talking about the idea he's going to be moved before the next election. And instead, I think that what we might have, given the polls are where they are, which depending on which pollster you read the most, is between a 15-point lead for Labour or a 25-point lead. I just think it's inevitable we're going to have some succession talk, which is, if the Tories lose the election, nothing drastic changes between now and next year, who is the most likely leader of the opposition? Now, already, as Iain has outlined, Suella Braverman is seen as someone who is positioning herself. But we're going to have lots of fringes. In conversations, I was looking at the guide earlier, Kemi Badenoch, obviously, I think...
She's all over the place.
Yeah, she's all over this. Though I will plug the Spectator in Conversation, which I think is only in conversation.
Can I plug my conversation with Steve Barclay?
Okay,
I've
got that
actually
one.
met, bizarrely.
Do you think he's a contender?
No.
Okay.
I will ask him.
Yeah,
Obviously.
good.
And he'll say, no, of course not. There won't be one. We're going to win.
Exactly what a contender would say.
James Cleverly in Conversation, Tom Tugendhat. You're going to see lots of the names that get thrown about doing these talks. I think the fact that James Cleverly, for example, is doing it in Conversation of Onward, which is very much a domestic think tank, and he is the Foreign Secretary. What is he going to have to say? Is he going to give his big views on domestic policy? In which case people will start to say, oh, maybe he's getting ready.
Kiss of death for James, I'm afraid, because I did the In Conversation with Onward last year with Ben Wallace. Ben who?
And then Miriam Cates, I think, is down to about 5 events. And I think actually, to your Suella Braverman point, I think there's an interesting debate going on with the right of the party amongst MPs at the moment, which is Suella Braverman definitely has her admirers on the right, but there are quite a few more, speaking to MPs, some advisors, who say that lots of them think, were Miriam Cates to somehow hold on to her seat, she would probably be in competition for Braverman, yeah.
So you're the first person I've ever met that has mentioned her name in the context of the leadership.
If you are speaking to Tory MPs, I do think that there is that think that she is someone who, when you think about her views on gender, some of the things she said on trans, she is seen as quite a good spokesperson for them. Now, I think the problem is, if you look, I think, electoral calculus, it gives her the estimate that she keeps hold of her seat, I think, is below 20% if the polls don't change. But it is someone who I keep actually hearing in that.
I always remember doing COVID, I interviewed her, and I can't remember what the interview was about, but she, at one point in the interview, we were talking about masks, and there was a big, should we wear masks on the Underground? And she said, I'm not going to wear a mask on the Underground. I said, but you're a leader. People take notice of what you say. You're an MP. No, people deserve to see my face, she said, which I thought was quite interesting.
Iain, you're going to be there broadcasting with LBC. Who, other than the names you just mentioned, who should we be keeping an eye on? Which fringes will you be looking at in particular?
Well, I think that the entire contest will be seen through the prism of the next leadership contest, which it is a little bit early to do that, given that we don't know when the election is going to be. Nobody does, no matter who tips it, when they don't know. And the poll lead that Katy just referred to, I mean, it is a big poll lead for Labour, but it's very fragile because it's an anti-conservative poll lead. It's not a Labour poll lead. I don't think many of these 20% are actually really enthusiastic about Labour. So although I think Labour, as we sit here now, will win, it's quite possible that events might dictate otherwise. Who knows what might happen over the next year?
Yeah, and I think that is the sense of almost fatalism that Rishi Sunak is trying to fight back from. And, I think the common question, you keep hearing it, which is, is there anything the Tories could actually do to turn things around? But I do think if we just think back to, this time last year and how much things changed from the year previously, it does show you there can be unexpected events. But for Rishi Sunak, he will be wanting to make it all about his pitch and try and stop it from being what this whole segment's been about, which is effectively, who would be the next leader of the opposition?
That's what we love talking about most, isn't
exactly.
it?
And that's what they want to stamp down on. I think the question is the net zero pivot, I think, I would say there was obviously a very loud part of the Tory party that doesn't like it. But generally the sense, I think, is, speaking to MPs and ministers, is at least they think there's something Rishi Sunak wants to have a fight about. Maybe he is finding that, energy, these signs that he will really go and fight against Labour in an election. So are we going to get more of that in his conference speech? Will there be more policy announcements? It's been closely guarded, but if so, is this going to be the moment where actually he looks a bit rejuvenated?
Iain, do you see any kind of territory where Rishi Sunak should be manoeuvring on to try and gain that kind of clear blue water with Labour? What do you think at this stage of Parliament, this stage of the party in government, 13 years, what really, can you see any levers he ought to pull ahead of next year's election?
It's a very difficult thing. When you've been in power as a party for so long and you say, well, we've got all these new ideas and here's what they are, and people automatically say, yeah, but why haven't you done them over the last 13 years? How can we trust you to do them over the next 4? So I think that's a problem for them. The other problem is that if Keir Starmer's got any sense, his entire election campaign, by which I mean from now on, will be to make people think, am I better off than I was 4 years ago or even 13 years ago? Most people will say no. And although I think elections in this country are not quite so much based on the state of the economy as are in America, it is the economy stupid generally. I think that there's much more at stake here. And you can always, or you could, and I think probably still can, rely on Labour to make the odd strategic mistake. Why is Keir Starmer banging on about Europe? He spent the last 3 years not banging on about Europe quite successfully. But he's now made people in the red wall seats remember that he was the one that wanted a second referendum and wanted more integration. And I do not understand the logic of what he's been doing over the last few weeks.
Whereas I think the one area where Labour is taking some delight in is the fact that Liz Truss will be at Tory conference. Because we often see Keir Starmer, I think, struggle to think, immediately or in the moment about how to respond to a policy position. So on net zero, he did a very bland, broad tweet about how he wanted to make the country a better place. And then it was quite a few hours later where we heard they'd stick with the 2030 car target. But the one thing they were really happy to attack on was Liz Truss. So I think the fact she is going to be there on the Monday, speaking at a rally on growth, that's going to be what they keep trying to focus on. And I think Labour tried to make as much hay as they can from this idea that Liz Truss is saying things that Rishi Sunak then does. Do I think it'll be very effective? I suppose just working within Westminster, I think that Number 10 paid quite little attention to what Liz Truss says, but that's not really the judge of it. It's whether voters buy it, and I think the jury's out on that.
Do you think there is a collective feeling of guilt among Conservative Party members for having voted Liz Truss in, and that if there were a leadership contest, they might look at Suella Braverman as the new Liz Truss and therefore think, we did that last time, didn't work out very well?
I'm not sure. I'm interested what you think about that. I haven't particularly got a sense of remorse. I do get a sense of actually frustration that they now have a leader who they didn't vote for and actually they, actively rejected.
I speak at the odd Tory party event and I can't find anybody that voted for Liz Truss now. And it is interesting that the fee, and I just put this down to they don't want to talk about it, but they know what they did.
One theory I had put to me by one Conservative MP was that last year at the Tory conference, the activists who are most likely to turn out and be at that conference were the ones who voted for Rishi Sunak, whereas a lot of the people who perhaps were less active in associations had voted for Liz Truss. So suddenly Tory MPs who maybe as an association had been told, everyone's voted for Liz Truss, suddenly had the activists who were then most likely out on the doorstep and facing that anger from people who'd voted for Sunak and couldn't believe that what was going on. So I had that put forward to me. Also, it's worth looking at Tim Bale's research, and he suggests that effectively the worse the defeat is for the Conservatives next time, actually, the more likely you're going to have those people in seats who voted, MPs in seats who voted for Rishi Sunak. So the idea being you could actually have a two-stage leadership contest whereby you have the Sunakite party in Parliament and then Trussite membership as a whole. And of course, how do you lead a party where the MPs don't want you but the membership does? And that could be an interesting question.
I chaired a parliamentary selection a few weeks ago, and it was very interesting. It was quite an elderly association, about 120 people there. And the 4 finalists came on the stage, did their pitches. They were all quite impressive in their own way. But the most right-wing one got it.
That traditionally was the rule of the Tory leadership.
I also think, I remember, James, we both attended the 1922 centenary dinner, and I was sat next to a member who was furious that the party had ousted Liz Truss. So I think there's a real mix of views there, and they thought, there was a conspiracy. And I think conference will be interesting for seeing, where the grassroots are in terms of where they flock to, who they seem to get behind, who has the largest queue. But to your point, James, it really does, I think, depend on the scale of defeat as to what you end up with.
One name we haven't mentioned is Penny Mordaunt. It's going to be very interesting to see what she does at the conference, how many fringes she's speaking at. I haven't heard of any so far, but and how much they put her out on the media.
She is also a real darling among certain sections of the party. I went to an event last year she was at, and she got cheered and whooped and provoked real sense in certain parts of the party which others wouldn't have had. And of course, will she going to hold on to her seat is a question. She got a majority of 16,000. Frank Lunt suggests that anything under 15,000 might be up in the air.
Well, she was a guest at one of my Edinburgh Fringe shows. I did 18 shows, and she sold the most tickets. And you think a Tory in Scotland selling tickets like that? Actually, Nicola Sturgeon just beat her, but we all know the reasons for that. But I thought that was quite an indication. She has an appeal outside the Tory party, and sometimes the Tory party needs to remember that they do actually, to win an election, you don't just need Conservatives voting for you, you need to have a much wider electoral coalition.
Quite. Thank you, Iain. Thank you, Katy. Svetlana Monets writes in this week's magazine about the possibility of a Ukrainian election. Who would dare stand against President Zelensky? Owen Matthews joins me now. Owen, Svetlana writes in this week's magazine about the possibility of Ukraine hosting elections. She says there's no serious opposition to Zelensky. Do you agree?
I think that's probably true. His ratings are still extraordinarily high. I think the issue, as Svetlana brilliantly sets out in her piece this week, is not so much the who will win, but the sort of general democratic legitimacy of the regime going forward. And there's a clear paradox here that Zelensky has, he originally came to power in 2019 with 73% of the vote. He won by a landslide. Then his popularity ratings fell to under 30% on the eve of the war. And now he's done such an amazing, impressive job as a wartime leader. They're back up to 80. But that's obviously not a situation that can continue indefinitely. And you have a fundamental tension between the popularity of the president and the executive powers that he's had to assume during wartime, and the potential conflict between those executive powers and the actual future of a democratic Ukraine.
You mentioned that word there, legitimacy. Obviously, one element to all this, of course, is the legitimacy President Zelensky enjoys in the eyes of his own people. But there's also an international element to all this, particularly given all the aid that's going to Ukraine. Lindsey Graham, who's been broadly pro-Ukraine on this, has suggested the view that there should be elections in Ukraine. How much is this shared by others in Washington, and will there be pressure from allies of Ukraine for those elections to be held sometime soon?
Well, yes, indeed. It's not just Lindsey Graham. He was in Kiev. Senator Graham is in Kiev with Elizabeth Warren. There's been calls basically from across the political spectrum. Tucker Carlson, the notorious ex-Fox News host, has also criticized Zelensky for not wanting to hold elections, and also the head of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. There have been sort of various calls from Ukraine's allies, both in Europe and the US, to hold elections. I think it's not an incredibly urgent problem because we're not talking about this year but next year. But nonetheless, I think this is going to feed into another issue, and that is that Ukraine is concerned, and rightly so, for that the huge support that it's enjoyed from the West will wane, and elections are going to be an element of that mix and the discussion about Ukraine as we go forward into a sort of more and more painful period for Ukraine of growing skepticism in Europe, as we're already seeing, and in America over continuing to arm Kiev. And so these two things are linked. It's Western support and elections all become part of the same discussion.
And who, if anyone, would want to stand against President Zelensky?
Well, interestingly, I mean, one of the there's the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko says that if we hold elections, we will lose the war, but that's because she will also lose the elections. One of the people who's been mentioned is a very prominent general, Valery Zaluzhny, who's actually been an enormous hero of the war and is very popular among Ukrainians. He's been mentioned as a possible successor to Zelensky, not necessarily as an opponent to Zelensky, actually, but as a successor. Should Zelensky himself wish to stand down, rather than, as Svetlana points out in the magazine this week, rather than risk a Churchill-style defeat, as Winston Churchill was, of course, voted out of power in 1945, having led Britain through World War II. All of this is pure speculation right now, because right now we're very far from an electoral season as yet in Ukraine.
And presumably, of course, that's going to be completely clouded by the questions about the war, and it's difficult to kind of see any sort of democratic or political debate that really moves much beyond that. But how much has there been in Ukraine in terms of looking towards the future? Obviously, we don't know yet the outcome of the war in terms of whether it's going to be a kind of overwhelming Ukrainian victory or going to be a stalemate of some kind. What kind of long-term thinking is going on in Ukraine about what the future of the country should look like?
I think that, I hate to be pessimistic, and I really wish I'm wrong, but I think there's actually going to be a very painful reckoning at a certain point about the loss of territories. And the paradox is that neither Zelensky nor any leader of Ukraine, whoever he or she may be, can politically survive agreeing to a land for peace deal. That's completely politically unsurvivable. Ukraine is very likely to become ungovernable at that point because of the millions of internally displaced persons, the hundreds of thousands of military veterans who've shed blood, and and if the victory is not complete, as defined by Zelensky and his team, in other words, recovering all the territories, including Crimea and the rebel republics of Donbass. Should that not happen, there's a gigantic political train wreck in the offing and a gigantic reckoning. And I don't think anyone in Kiev is really ready to deal with that. And that's why there's been such a strong reaction when someone like a former presidential advisor, Alexei Arestovich, said very controversially back in August, if the price of Ukraine's joining the EU and NATO is the loss of Donbass and Crimea, that's a price worth paying, says Alexei Arestovich. And that was enormously explosive and extremely controversial. And so far, none of that discussion is really in the political mainstream. Everyone is still concentrating on the full victory, in which, according to polls, 93% of Ukrainians still believe.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, in Westminster, we refer to politicians rolling the pitch, preparing an announcement, trying to get a conversation going for some controversial policy proposal, but nothing, obviously, like what's going on in Ukraine. And I mean, from the sound of it, then there can really be no countenance of the idea or entertaining the idea of anything approaching a land deal or anything that isn't pre-2014 borders. In those circumstances, it seems very difficult, whereby someone like President Zelensky, who's been such an iconic figure, would somehow be able to survive in those conditions. Is there any kind of sense of how Ukraine develops over the next sort of year or two in terms of having that conversation? Or is it really just carry on until, frankly, they can't fight anymore?
I think the latter. I mean, as I said, there hasn't really been any serious mainstream discussion, and it's entirely understandable, in fact, because the country is still at war and is still asking and, in fact, conscripting people to go and fight at the front lines. So, for very obvious reasons, any any talk of a compromise with Putin is regarded as treasonous, and also, by the way, objectively useless, because right now there is actually no circumstance, there's no willingness or realistic expectation that Putin is ready to do any kind of deal. The process of any kind of end game is still politically very far away, and there's still an awful lot of fighting to be done. So as yet, there's actually no serious discussions. I mean, the discussions will come, and I suspect will be extremely painful if the Americans are right. I mean, we've seen a lot of material being leaked officially, unofficially through the press and through internet leaks from the American defense establishment that are very pessimistic about the Ukrainian chances of a breakthrough. That's I have no personal opinion, but I'm just quoting the what we understand the American military's view to be, that Ukraine is not going to achieve militarily the goals that it's set politically, and that's going to be a really difficult conversation, but and an extremely painful political process. But as yet, Ukraine is very far from being ready to have that.
Thank you, Owen, for joining us on Spectator TV. And finally, what was Ian Fleming really like? Nicholas Shakespeare has written the first authorised biography of Fleming since 1966, and it's been released next month. To talk all about James Bond's creator, Nicholas joins me now. Nicholas, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Your new book, Ian Fleming, The Complete Man, is reviewed by Philip Hensher in this week's magazine. It's the first authorised biography of Fleming for 50 years or so. Tell us, how did it come about and why now?
Well, I was asked by the family, Peter Fleming's two daughters, if I would consider writing a new authorised biography. I'm a novelist, and I didn't really want to spend 4 years of my life in the company of somebody who, through sideways glimpses, I perceived as a kind of a bit of a cad, a wife-beating sadist with a sardonic Etonian approach to life. I'd written a book previously about Churchill coming to power in 1940, and I'd gone into some of the Fleming archives about his brother Peter, who was a very much more famous Fleming for many years, a bit like Evelyn Moore's brother Alec, much more famous, and the pedestal firstborn child was much more famous than the black sheep's second son. So I'd done some research on Peter Fleming, and I think the family had seen what I'd done about him arriving in Norway in 1940 as one of the first officers in the Second World War to land on occupied soil. And they asked me if I'd consider writing a new authorised biography of Fleming. There'd been one authorised biography in 1966 by John Pearson. And since then, 30 years had passed, and Andrew Lycett had then done a very full, good biography, not authorised, but that had filled in many gaps. But 30 years on, I think the family felt still a lot of stuff had come out, and probably since James Bond appears practically every day in the newspapers, it was probably ripe for him to be kind of brought up to date, like the films have been brought up to date, maybe bring up, a biography that's up to date with all that's been found out since. I said, okay, is there anything more to find out about Fleming? I mean, surely this is a vineyard that's been tilled to sterility. So I was given kind of 2 months to do some due diligence, and I went to interview some of the people who very few people left who remember him. I found some of the letters that they were prepared to give me if I found a publisher. Although it was authorized, it wasn't commissioned, so I had to find my own publisher, and that's good because it meant I could maintain editorial integrity and everything. They had no say over the final product. And what tilted me was, do I want to spend 3 or 4 years in the company of a cad, was my kind of question. And what tilted me were two things. I discovered that he was a much kinder man than I had hitherto anticipated, that every woman who was in love with him talked about his kindness. And even the kind of mistress he had during the war, a wonderful woman called Maud Russell, who bought Goldeneye for him, she says 7 years after he dies, I think of Ian continually, above all, his kindliness. Now, that's not a quality you associate with James Bond. And it was repeated again and again by women he'd had affairs with, they kept on loving him. I thought that's really interesting for a biographer. The second thing that I discovered was that he was much more important than I'd been prepared to believe. I assumed that he was a kind of, he'd invented a lot of stuff in the war, that he pretended he was a bit more kind of glamorous and heroic than he'd been, and he'd cast this into Bond. What I discovered was that he couldn't write about his war material because it was so, he was absolutely in the inner sanctum of British intelligence. Unlike Le Carré, who I'd known for 30 years and who I also knew, they were very minor players in British intelligence. I mean, Graham Greene was in Sierra Leone, and John Le Carré was sent to Bonn or Hamburg and never had a successful mission, I don't think. And I talked to him about this. Iain Fleming, by contrast, he practically ran naval intelligence during the war, and he was involved in so many different areas of the war. I mean, not only did he set up this intelligence gathering commando unit, 30AU, which went ahead with the advanced troops and captured the ciphers and the Enigma machines that then were sent back to Bletchley and helped shorten the war by 18 months in some people's estimation. He also was one of 2 or 3 people who helped set up the American Foreign Intelligence Service, the OSS, which eventually in 1947 became the CIA. He's one of only 2 or 3 people in the room setting this up along the lines of British intelligence. So this was hinted at, but none of it had really come out. I mean, when it came out that he was quite important, it used to come out in things like a man called Creighton, who pretended to be the godson of Desmond Morton, Churchill's great intelligence chief. Creighton wrote a book in which he pretended he went back to Berlin with Fleming, kayaked up the river to rescue Martin Bormann, and took Bormann away. I mean, he writes this as fact. And then Dove Hart Davis, who ghostwrote it, who had also written Peter Fleming's biography, has told me that he realized things were going wrong when Creighton told him that as they were leaving the Berlin bunker, they got Hitler too, but then Hitler's head was blown off by a Russian shell. Now, that's the problem with Fleming, is that you have people who either say he was just a kind of desk-bound, chocolate sailor looking after ashtrays, or you have people saying he was kind of rescuing Hitler from the Berlin bunker. And what took 3 or 4 years to negotiate was the zigzag between, in which he was really quite important, not to the extent of bringing Hitler out of the bunker, but really with his finger in lots of different bunkers in British intelligence, what Admiral Godfrey, his boss, called the citadel, the unapproachable citadel of British intelligence.
And so in trying to distinguish fact from fiction, how much of a challenge was it in looking at Fleming's wartime service and espionage career? How much of that is still classified 70, 80 years on?
Hard to know, because if a SIS file exists on him, we don't know, and certainly I wouldn't be allowed to see it. What is clear is that quite a lot of his stuff has never been released. I mean, he chaired JIC meetings. He was part of those who contributed to the Bland Report, which was setting up what the future of British intelligence would look like in 1945. He chaired, in August 1945, he's chairing the Joint Intelligence Bureau to discuss the future of British intelligence. Now, it's clear that had he stayed on in 1945, which he was asked to do, he probably would have himself become head of British intelligence. But he leaves. He wants to go off to Jamaica. He wants to join the Sunday Times, where he's being offered a wonderful possibility of replicating Reuters and replicating naval intelligence by setting up a foreign intelligence service called the Mercury Service, which had 88 foreign correspondents abroad, many of them ex-spooks, many of them naval intelligence. And these were kind of, set off to look at what's happening with communist influence abroad. And he would send many of the SITREPs, as he called it, onto British intelligence. So for a few years after the war, he was, in a sense, running his own intelligence service under the guise of being the foreign manager of the Sunday Times. When that all goes slightly pear-shaped because there's too much money to do this, and the owner of the Sunday Times didn't really want to spend too much money, Fleming kind of escapes marriage back into his bachelor existence. And what it seems to me he does is he follows with Bond the adventures that he might have done had he, Fleming, continued to be in British intelligence in an important role, probably more like M than Bond. And so many of Bond's adventures are kind of the type of operations Fleming had himself suggested during the Second World War, wasn't allowed to put into operation, often because he was too valuable a commodity. I mean, he was one of only 30 indoctrinated people to ultra, and he really couldn't be risked falling into enemy hands. And so I think when people say, oh, he was a coward, he never had action, they don't realize he wasn't allowed to do many of the operations he himself put forward to do. I mean, his famous Operation Ruthless, where he's going to crash land a Heinkel in the Channel and capture a German speedboat to try and get Enigma keys from that. So that, in a sense, all the operations he'd planned in the Second World War, many of whom he sent agents to do, he knew about. But when it comes to the Cold War, he puts these operations in a Cold War setting, and he sends James Bond off against the Russians instead of the Germans. And the other thing that struck me as quite forcibly is that he's been held up as a kind of wonderful precursor of the sexual revolution of the 60s. Well, if you look at what they were getting up to in the Blitz, I mean, they were hopping into bed with everybody every night. And I think all he's doing with his sexual shenanigans, he's transferring the kind of fetid heat of the Blitz into a Cold War setting.
Our finest hour, indeed. I was just wondering, in the 1940s, obviously, you got the career in spying, the spook game. In the 1950s, he moves on to writing. How does Fleming's writing change over time, particularly after the films come out from 1962 onwards?
I think it bears repeating that he only writes the Bond books in the last 12 years of his life, when essentially his life's over. I mean, all the interesting bits he's done, and he's got married to his pregnant fiancée, Anne Rothermere, who had been the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail. And it struck me only last week that a moral of the Fleming story is, don't run off with the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail if you don't wish to forever after be rendered into tabloid fat. I think one of the problems about Fleming is that we do see him as this caricature, as a kind of wife-beating sadist who rolls home late at night from his golf club and goes up the stairs and smokes lots of cigarettes, while his wife's kind of overeducated friends are sniggering about his latest book down below. That is very much a kind of Daily Mail reaction to Fleming. I mean, they didn't review his first book, and I think they were quite hostile to him for totally understandable reasons for many years afterwards. But that image, I think, settled in the public mind, and it's been quite difficult to shift. People don't really want to hear that actually he was quite a nice person who was a lot more important than we realize. And so, going back to the Bond books. So the Bond books, he writes them in 2 months, punctual as blossom. Every January, he sits down with his typewriter that had carried him through Room 39 and Reuters, and he clatters them out. He doesn't look back. He writes them very quickly, like a Reuters journalist. And he never gets to read them through until he takes them to New York to show them to his first editor, Claire Blanchard, another woman from intelligence who he'd recruited to the Sunday Times. And what's very remarkable is he's not kind of at all affected by his prose. I think he's quite keen to be considered on a level with Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, two people he knew. But he knew he probably didn't have the patience or the dedication to write books that would be like that, even though he admired them. And I think the quality of the Bond books, I mean, I reread them just before I began writing my biography, and I mean, they're terrifically energetic and alive. And at his best, he's like Jon Barker or Eric Ambler, or even better. I think where they fall down is that sometimes he just doesn't go back and do a rewrite. So we have the kind of sometimes just the patchy first draft in between some much better stuff, but they're still very readable. And I think as for the quality, well, I think because he suddenly created this machine that takes off, it again, probably people would be surprised to hear that they don't take off immediately. I mean, he's writing his 5th book, From Russia with Love, I think it was, when he decides to kill Bond off, because none of them had sold more than about 8,000 copies. And at the end of, you'll remember, at the end of From Russia with Love, Rosa Klebb kind of poisons him with a steel-capped boot. And we don't know if Bond's going to come back from the dead. And I think when Fleming goes to Jamaica that year, he tells his editor, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do another Bond. So what changes? Well, the Suez Crisis changes. Anthony Eden has this disastrous invasion, probably the most important piece of drama for Britain post-war, where we do a kind of a D-Day, but without the Americans, and it goes wrong. And Eden asked to go to Goldeneye, where Bond had been conceived 4 years earlier, to recuperate. So Eden arrives, and the house becomes one of the most famous houses in the world for 3 weeks, while Eden is like a kind of Bond villain, sending out messages from the gazebo to halt the kind of, to get the British soldiers out, and he sends telegrams. There's no telephone there, so telephones have to be installed. He's a bit like Drax in Moonraker in Ebury Street. But what happens is that Eden collapses and his reputation sinks, even as James Bond's reputation rises. I mean, the lovely image, Eden is paddling around the beach at Goldeneye in Fleming's rubber dinghy, which has a leak. And so Eden's kind of sinking even as he's paddling around. And from the same waters, James Bond kind of emerges as the kind of the balm for an empire that has been lost to Britain. And it seems that the lower the sun sinks on the empire that Bond was born into, the brighter the glow of Bond. He becomes a kind of one-man Suez force, if you like. So what happens is that Lord Beaverbrook, who also has a house in Jamaica, decides to serialize From Russia with Love. And suddenly we go through the sound barrier from 8 to 12,000 copies to 20,000 copies. And so Fleming goes back to Jamaica. Instead of not writing another Bond book, he writes Dr. No. By this time, he's created the machine that is now galloping ahead, and he has to feed it every year. So from then on until he dies, he has to feed this kind of monster he's created. And it is in monster terms that many of his first biographer, John Pearson, described, a Frankenstein monster he creates that ends up devouring him. And one of I knew the War family. I did some documentaries on Evelyn Waugh many years ago, and what I remember was that they kept telling me that the best charade Evelyn Waugh ever did was at the end of the school holidays, just after Fleming had died, and Evelyn Waugh was asked to perform the word bondsman. And so he gets on his black tie at the end of dinner, he gets onto the carpet, and he mimics Ian Fleming kneeling on the carpet to Anne Fleming, his wife, and saying, I've got an idea that's going to make us millions. All this is done silently. And then it ends up with the creature he creates, James Bond, throttling Fleming. So Evelyn Waugh dies on the carpet, with a death rattle, with his hands around his throat, to mimic the fact that he and everybody else who around Fleming believed that Fleming had created this character who would end up kind of eating him.
Well, aren't we glad he now persists to this current day? Nicholas, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode.